Welcome back to the 17th Annual Diversity Matters Lecture Series. Your microphones and your chat with other audience members are turned off. Send your messages or questions for the speaker through the chat function to moderator Barbara Velasquez. I will present your questions to our speaker in the Q&A period. Also, please watch that chat for a link to an online evaluation and other important messages, including the opportunity to win a copy of our presenter's book, Centering Possibility in Black Education. Today, we're honored to welcome Dr. Chezare Holman, board member for the Omaha Public Schools and associate professor of practice and P12 school leadership, MED coordinator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the College of Education and Human Sciences. She will introduce our speaker. Thank you so much, Dr. Holman, and welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see so many familiar faces. Welcome to today's wonderful presentation. I have the honor of introducing our esteemed speaker for today. Dr. Chezare A. Warren is the Associate Professor of Equity and Inclusion in Education Policy at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College of Education and Human Development. He is a scholar of race and intersectional justice with interest in understanding the conditions that enable Black boys' education success. A former secondary math teacher and school administrator from Chicago, Dr. Warren is a recipient of numerous national recognitions for a scholarship, including the 2018 American Educational Research Association Teaching and Teacher Education Early Career Award. Author of Centering Possibility in Black Education and the award-winning Urban Preparation, Young Black Men Moving from Chicago's South Side to Success in Higher Education, Dr. Warren has written more than 40 articles, reports, and book chapters. He is a widely sought after consultant on issues of education equity and has held visiting faculty appointments at Stanford University, University of Pennsylvania, and New York University. For more information about Dr. Warren, you can reach out to him at www.chezarewarren.com. Let's go ahead and give Dr. Warren virtual hand claps, snaps, whatever it is that you do to recognize him. Welcome, Dr. Warren.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holman. Thank you for this invitation to my colleagues at MCC and for all of you for being in the room. I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully get this right. Okay. We connected? Give me a thumbs up so I know we're in the right place. Okay, perfect. All right. So thank you all so much again for being here and for sharing a little space and time. Happy Valentine's Day to those of you who are observing, even to those of you who are not. I'm sending you lots of love. I would be remiss if I didn't just stop for a moment to just give a moment of silence for the lives that were lost in Michigan State. I spent 7 years on the faculty there prior to coming to Vanderbilt, so admittedly I'm a little heavy this afternoon. So I just want to give a second just to remember the students who lost their lives and for all of those in the MSU community who are affected and for all of us who are constantly a witness to senseless violence. I again want to thank you. I want to thank the organizers for making time for this conversation, a conversation I've invested my life and career in having, and that conversation being how it is that we can love and care for Black children and Black people in education, which I'll say sort of shortly, my trajectory, I was a middle school and high school math teacher on the south side of Chicago. I don't know if there are any native Chicagoans. I don't know, is Nebraska the Midwest? I think Nebraska, I feel like, okay. So I feel like I'm in good company with folks who are from the Midwest. But I cut my teeth on the south side of Chicago and just had lots of questions about how it is that we do work in ways that humanize the teaching and learning enterprise for young people and Black young people in particular. And that work is sort of crescendoed into an academic career where now I'm serving as a professor of equity and inclusion in education policy, with my research program truly anchored in and centering on how it is that we create the conditions that facilitate Black children's well-being in education and beyond. And so the book that I'm really happy to share and talk about today, Centering Possibility in Black Education, I describe it as the substance of my freedom dreams, and it is very much a reflection of some deep thinking and reflecting that I did in New York City during a fellowship I had there, where I read a book called Freedom Dreams by Robin D.G. Kelley, if anybody in the room is familiar, who's a historian of intellectual history. And he wrote this book with the question in mind: what are the Black orators and activists and artists who we love and respect from the period of the Black Power movement, late 60s up through the 70s, what was occupying their imagination as they pursued the justice campaigns for which they are presently known and celebrated? And from that reading and thinking came my thinking and theorizing of possibility. And so I'm excited to share with you just a few of the thoughts that sort of flow from this work, and to leave you with some questions, and hopefully then invite us into a conversation around these ideas and how they might animate the work that you're doing in the places that you are occupying. I want to say this is not your traditional academic book. It is very much rooted in an intellectual tradition, and it's interdisciplinary in nature, but really I wrote it for a very lay audience. There are lots of pictures in it. There's art from over 15 different Black artists from around the country, from spoken word to photographs to portraiture. And the work is really tied to these stories, both my own stories, but also the stories of those who have come before us, to sort of animate and give life to this concept of possibility. And so we're going to jump in right here. Being woke don't always feel so good. Black people dying everywhere I look. I want out of this reality. Can I go back to sleep? Dream of lands in an unknown place, Afrofuturistic galaxies. Black joy is in that space, melanated humanity. But I am here and this don't feel so great. Black suffering in these United States. My Blackness ain't a burden, no matter what they say. Morning. I am okay. I'll be all right. Possibilities born at night. Morning. It'll be all right. It's in the morning. I found myself in 2020, at the time that I was writing this book, thinking a lot about the state of mourning that all of us were sort of mired in, that we couldn't escape. It was both the mourning of life lost in relationship to the pandemic and COVID-19, but it was also the mourning of state violence and the ways that Black people, as a reflection of our Blackness, makes us a curious figure to be exterminated or to be disposed of. And we watched that happen in real time in May 2020, when we observed the life of George Floyd being taken away. It got me to thinking a lot about the space of mourning that Black folks have a hard time escaping. That it is in and through such mourning, however, that we might be able to glimpse forms of possibilities and alternative futures that we might not otherwise have. But it also then got me coming back to think about the literature, and in particular, the analytic and heuristic value of a framework like anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism for helping us to understand the state and condition of the world that we're in. And it got me asking a few questions. What does it mean for a Black child to never see themselves reflected in the curriculum? to never have a teacher who looks like them, to rarely be acknowledged for what they do well, to be often assumed as up to no good, to have their opinions and perspectives ignored, to have their joy demonized and criminalized, to have their needs, desires, passions, and longings overlooked, sidelined, and minimized, to have their families and communities disregarded and left behind, to earn respect by dulling their personality, character, and learning to practice talking and speaking and being in ways that are palatable to the adults who are educating them. What you get is an experience of school that is indeed painful, and a young person who struggles to find their curiosities, explore their possibilities, and cultivate their genius. What we know, however, is that schools are reflections of our society. In other words, the aforementioned experiences are not unique to schools or a classroom alone, but they happen in every social institution, from healthcare to tech to criminal justice to arts and entertainment. And so what we know is that Black folks in the US have always been in and known mourning. From the time of our African ancestors' involuntary arrival to the Americas, we've had to often mourn the dispossession of our bodies, our way of life, our languages, and forcibly disconnected from Afrocultural ways of being. The remnants of such loss follows us into the present day and is indeed exacerbated by the global pandemic in which we live. And so I'll punctuate the talk a little bit with some excerpts from the book, but also the images that you see on screen are images that also appear in the book. With every word, every paragraph, every page, and every essay or chapter written and centering possibility, I was learning to breathe again. Even as an academic, I'm a Black man first. And as a Black man who understands the feeling of suffocation by systems, policies, and practices that care more about my labor than about me, I wrote the book that I needed to read in 2020. In fact, I wrote the book that I've always needed to read every year of my life. And my insistence on centering possibility in this work of Black education transformation is primarily aspirational. And I'm certainly clear about the many barriers to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness facing Black identified individuals in the United States. And still, I rather write a book musing our possibilities than centering on our problems. So part of what I also want to share here is that much of my thinking and the work of doing Black education has to have, for me, has had to come from the place of imagining what else exists on the other side of our terror. It also gets me to thinking about the many ways that we are recognizing the residual consequences of chattel slavery. I'm thinking a lot about the work of Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten and Christina Sharp, and the many people who theorize what it means to live in the wake of slavery or in the afterlife of slavery, to sort of see the ways that the American mainstream psychology recognizes Black people first for the ability to control and to capture, rather than for the ability to see and appreciate the value we bring to the world just by virtue of our own humanity. Right. This is an image that appeared on the cover of the book that's an ode to Henrietta Lacks, and he actually drew this on the pages of the book. A decade earlier than Robin D.G. Kelley, Derek Bell contended in Faces at the Bottom of the Well, similar to Frantz Fanon, decades before him, that anti-Black racist power structures may never be fully overthrown. And this declaration alone might be cause for mourning. Each of these thinkers across 3 generations insisted, and I agree, that resigning oneself to such a dark reality was an essential beginning to the longer project of Black freedom necessary to undermine and undo anti-Black oppressive systems. For me, coming to think about and theorize possibility as a mechanism for advancing Black education transformation has meant returning again and again to a place of mourning. read a period of darkness, perhaps Blackness, by reckoning with the unfortunate long-term residual impacts of chattel slavery and settler colonialism. Put plainly, one residual consequence is the imagination of Black bodies to be controlled and managed in and through deficit perspectives of Black youth families and communities, particularly as those perspectives and those social constructions of Blackness are likened more to evil than they are to good, right? To bad more often than they are to good or innocent and pure. Acknowledging the conditions that cast Blackness in these ways is indeed painful, but is also a choice to, after having mourned the failure of this democracy to represent us, to actively gaze upon Blackness with deep affection. In other words, possibility is the product of acknowledging our pain and then refusing it. It is leaning into solidarities of radical love to find strength to resist and oppose our suffering, and indeed to insist on our humanity. It is in and through such meditations that we might get to and behold the place of possibility. And even in this moment, I am reminded of two figures in Black history who tend to be talked about and canonized as polars, right? We think about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. We sort of think about them as very different ideologically, philosophically. One's nonviolent, one is like, don't give them no more cheeks to slap, right? But part of what history has told us about their lives, especially as they closer to the times that they were taken from us, is that ideologically they started to come to understand that the fight for Black rights was a part of a larger global fight for human rights, and that it's not enough to be just included at the table, but that there is an insistence that we need to have in our justice work, that we recognize Black humanity and Black dignity as the foremost concern that drives the work that we do, not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? We don't want to be just included to a table that we didn't help build, and or a table that is built not with us in mind. We want to be understanding our work as hinging upon challenging those around us to recognize and see our humanity as substance enough to do the work that needs to be done to restore and repair all that's been broken. So in November 2016, part of it, and we know what happened in November 2016. I remember at that particular time waking up to the news of 45 and feeling this deep sense of sadness and grief for myself. Is this something or someone had died? And even as a person who studies race and racism and white supremacy and whiteness, it still didn't register to me that the country could elect a person who was so blatantly white supremacist. And so I found myself sort of stuck in a place of mourning, but the way that I was able to care for myself, even in that particular moment, was to turn into my own beauty and brilliance and those of other Black people, and to find the joy and the art that was so important to sustaining Black folks through multiple periods of racial terror in this country. And so part of that, fast forwarding to 2019, led me to Harlem, New York, and New York City, where that is, arguably the epicenter of Black art, creativity, and culture. And so I'll share a little bit more here from the book. New York City is a mystical place. Cue Jay-Z and Alicia Keys' Empire State of Mind. Being a native Chicagoan, I'm accustomed to city life, the perfectly orchestrated chaos, and the brilliant sights. The urgent pace at which everything moves in New York City was not unsurprising to me, but sauntering through Harlem invited a most precious opportunity to ponder Blackness anew from anywhere else I'd been in the world. Home to one of the most profound cultural arts and intellectual movements in American history, the residual creative energy of ancestors who include Nina Simone, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston was palpable. The beautiful gift of time I was granted to live in New York City, being swallowed up by the curious scents and sounds of impassioned street discourse, nudged me towards several important questions about dreaming and freedom and the significance of possibility to realizing one's dreams of freedom. What leads an individual to dream in the first place? How and why is dreaming essential to Black people's thriving in a country built by our ancestors' bare hands? And how does one ready oneself to peer beyond the dual legacies of chattel slavery and settler colonialism to imagine a future in these United States absent of racial terror? In between checking Google Maps to learn the New York City subway system, I found myself time and time again contemplating the freedom dreams of activists and social movements in the Black radical tradition. Kelly, in his intellectual history of Black activists, documented in the book Freedom Dreams that I referenced a little earlier here, like those in the previous slides, the Black radical imagination relies on a deep meditation of who or what one is fighting for, rather than who or what one is fighting against. I'll say that again. The Black radical imagination relies on a deep meditation on who or what we're fighting for, rather than who or what we're fighting against. A focus on what one is fighting against mirrors an orientation to activism that is preoccupied with the incessant racialized assault Black people have long endured and overcome. But when we talk about who or what we're fighting for, we're centering ourselves foremost on the substance of young people, of the future of their futures, and being driven by creating and weaving the worlds, right, that they need. And part of, I'll sort of say this here parenthetically, when I have this conversation, part of what I want to communicate is that all of us have to figure out what our project is. For some of us, our project might be dismantling racism. But I would argue for others of us, that's not our project. Our project is building and creating space for those of us in our care to thrive, right? And Black folks did not create racism, so I think it's a little unfair to think that Black folks should be responsible for dismantling it. There is some responsibility, though, as I think about myself, to take up space in an institution that is historically and predominantly white, for those who are coming behind me, and for those that I can open the door, right? And making sure that there are opportunities for those folks to thrive. So when you think about these folks on the screen, and I'll invite you here to sort of get into the chat and be responsive. What was occupying the imagination of these activists in the Black radical tradition? What did they see? What were they saying to themselves? Even as they were looking at racial terror in the face in many cases, what was in their minds when they considered the work that they needed to do on behalf of Black people? Let's give us a second to think about that. And if you feel compelled, I'll invite you to share your thoughts in the chat. I found myself asking this question quite a bit as I was reading the book, but also just sort of making my way around Harlem. If you've not been to New York and visited the Schomburg, I mean, it's just a beautifully rich archive of primary resources, worth investigating.
Dr. Warren?
Yeah.
We have a request for you to restate the question that you'd like people to put in the chat.
Oh, sure. My question was, when you see these folks on the screen, we got Ella Baker, we got Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, Marcus Garvey. What was in their minds as they were strategizing and creating the justice campaigns that we know them for? What do you imagine they saw? And I'm asking this in response to what I was just saying about Robin D.G. Kelley, who studied these folks, in particular, their ideas about justice and freedom. And he talks about this as the Black radical imagination. And he talks about that these folks sort of anchored themselves to notions of what they were fighting for above and beyond what they were fighting against. So I was just an invitation for us to think out loud, if folks had something to say, just about what they saw, what images came to mind. And if there's anybody that wants to come off chat, come off mute to just share their thoughts, I'm happy to give a little space for that.
Okay, I've got one here. It won't be given to us. We have to get it. Pride, hope.
Yeah. Pride, hope. And I think what's interesting too, we've heard conversations about reparations, and I appreciated that first comment in particular, is because part of what these folks recognize is that we need our own institutions, right? I think it was Carter G. Woodson who wrote a paper in 1933 in the Journal of Negro Education, and he said, does the Negro need separate schools? And part of what he was writing, we know Plessy in 1896, separate but equal, but part of what Woodson was recognizing even then was that the institution of education is still not an institution that belongs to us. In part, you know, what he writes in Miseducation of the Negro, right, that came out about that same time, if you've been educated in the oppressor schools, you are going to adopt and reproduce the logics of the oppressor. So there is something to recognizing one's own value and beauty and brilliance as a precursor for doing any of the sort of justice work that we want to do when we sit around the table in a diversity, equity, and inclusion meeting, right? This is not me demonizing DEI work. I think it's work that needs to be done, but this is an invitation to consider the philosophies of Blackness, for example, that drive one to the table. And what we consider as a part of the work, are we more driven by recreating the space to be more palatable to Black bodies? Are we more driven by how it is that we might find our own resources and institutions and/or push the institution to give us the resources we need to create the sort of spaces that we need that value us in all of the ways that we show up as humans? That's a fundamentally, those things are different. Those are different paradigms, right? And I think Kelly invites us to ask that question.
Dr. Warren, there's a couple others that have come in. Freedom to be equal and Black power.
Okay. And these, you know, we recognize many of the fist as a sort of sign of Black power. And I think when folks see that, they think it means anti-white. And that's not what that means. That is a sign of pride and confidence and reclaiming constructions of Black that have otherwise been demeaning of Black people, right? Re-understanding and reauthorizing the narrative of Blackness and assigning power and boldness to it is a way to sort of push back against the more anti-Black social constructions that sort of follow Black folks in this country from chattel slavery on.
Okay,
all right, I'm gonna move
one more. They use these platforms to use their voice to fight pride, hope, Black excellence. We deserve equality and will fight.
For sure. Yeah. So I think you all are, I think that I would agree that all of these things are important. And I will add, as they're figuring out how to fight, there's something that has to continue to anchor them, right? And to hold the work in place, even when it feels like very little in the work is getting, in terms of material improvements, very little progress is being made, right? So here, I want to sort of turn our attention back to this conversation on possibility, because I'm very much inspired by these folks. And in my thinking of possibility, trying to make sense of what it means in contemporary Black education. And so to keep it simple, I see Black education as a field that is engaged with understanding, unpacking, and uncovering pathways to Black people's holistic human well-being. And there's no shortage of papers or talks, articles or documentaries, news stories, documenting our pain and our suffering and our work, whether it be abolition, reparations, anti-racism, social justice, or whatever you want to call it, cannot be limited to the critique of disruption or dismantleship. I may have made that one up, but what I'm trying to say is that our work has to include construction, building, establishing, and creating the worlds that Black children want, need, desire, and deserve. And that work, in my mind, begins with possibilities, not problems. And it's possibility that is obsessed above and beyond with the future and not the past and the present, right? And that's what we're fighting for. And I think about a figure, a very famous abolitionist that most of us in the room would know as Harriet Tubman. What was in her mind as she led Black folks out of the South into the North and then kept going back and getting folks? What did she see in terms of our possibility that drove her to risk her life and the lives of the folks that she was saving to go back multiple times to emancipate people out of the antebellum South? I think possibility as a concept, as a construct, as a concept, holds a lot of value that could be very useful to us in our work as we imagine the sort of work that we need to be doing on behalf of Black folks in education. And I also just say here parenthetically that too often our reading and hearing about Black folks stops at the point of our oppression, right? And so I think it's important to talk about schooling as sites of Black pain and suffering, but again, that's a beginning and a start point to the work. It's not work that I don't necessarily see justice work or abolition as trying to negate or minimalize or peripheralize the fact that schooling can be a very painful experience. But what it is inviting us to do when I say center possibility, is inviting us to put that conversation in its proper place, allow it to frame how we understand the issue writ large, and then it is from there that we sort of engage in the larger project and larger work needed to undo the sort of racial harm that education institutions have perpetrated against Black bodies. Centering possibility is my urgent invitation that Black education practice and policy be primarily guided by who or what we're fighting for, and to a far lesser extent, who or what we're fighting against. Racism, as I mentioned a little earlier, is a system of power created in the settler colonial imagination. And in that imagination, by those who might be identified as white, it is built and maintained a system of privilege and power that disproportionately advantages those who are male, who are Christian, who are English speaking, who are able-bodied, who are cisgender, who are heterosexual. And so those folks have a disproportionate burden, I believe, in undoing that system. And for those of us who are living in multiple hierarchies of oppression and disadvantage, that we find where it is that we are located on that continuum of justice work. So if you would, just indulge me for a moment here. Have you ever paused on a clear night and looked up? Maybe you're walking along the shoreline of your favorite beach, sitting with friends in a park, or taking a stroll to relieve yourself of a confounding personal dilemma. The next thing you know, you found yourself smitten by the vastness of the nighttime sky. Whether standing erect or lying on your back in silence, imagine the humility you might feel attempting to comprehend what was happening thousands of miles away in the deep, dark unknown. You do not move, you do not speak, you just stare up as far as your imagination will take you. So much so, time is no longer of consequence. And while the naked eye beholds stars innumerable, all you can do is gaze in splendid wonder. You are suspended in imagination. Alternatively, maybe you're a science fiction aficionado who can't help but deliberate about creatures born of galaxies untold, who toil in service to preserve humanity's need for night, indeed for Blackness. You may not be able to name all of what is percolating beyond the Earth's atmosphere when you gaze up into the unobstructed nighttime sky, but then you remember how it is this same sky, these same stars that guided your ancestors fleeing the antebellum South to find freedom in the North. You're moved to tears as you contemplate your own North Star. You surmise that whatever is happening in the great Black beyond is fantastic and grand and infinite in possibility. Cue William Ernest Henley, Invictus. out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever guys may be for my unconquerable soul. The harder you strain to see, the darker the sky becomes. And without fail, nighttime marks the end of each day for you, good or bad. And in this instance, you are startled to the realization that the dark of night engenders peace. Nighttime is when you find rejuvenation and solitude from the rigors of daytime labor. In the black of your sleeping quarters, you slumber uninterrupted. You dream in the dark, and perhaps you are privileged by a deep sleep filled with images of the most vivid and fanciful variety. Thinking of it this way, Blackness takes on new meaning. It has new significance, not just for its pedestrian affordances such as rest, but for representation of what can be, our possibility. Now more than ever, we need the strength to love and to dream. We must tap the well of our own collective imaginations that we do what earlier generations have done, which is to dream. And I feel compelled even in this moment when people hear dream in Black History Month, we tend to think of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, but this is not, I think, a dream that is without material consequences or a structural analysis. There's an interview with King 11 months before he was assassinated, where the interviewer is essentially saying, we have the Civil Rights Act, we got the Voting Rights Act. I mean, what is it that the Blacks really want? I mean, this is what he says. What is it that the Blacks really want? And what King is trying to articulate to this gentleman is that Black folks were emancipated, but we were emancipated to famine, right? The GI Bill did not benefit Black veterans the way that it benefited white veterans. There is generational wealth that has been underwritten by the state that Black folks have been locked out of. And so you can't tell to a bootless man to pull himself up by the bootstraps, right? Everything about the American dream and the ethos of American democracy, on the one hand, rests and is rooted in the labor, the blood, the sweat, and the toil of Black folks. And on the other hand, those same Black folks cannot look down the line and see that their children have full and unadulterated access to that which they bled and died for. And so he raises this contradiction in this interview 11 months before he was assassinated, but that's not the King that we tend to think about when we hear dreaming. And what Kelly is making reference to in his conversation about the dream is our ability to both recognize the world that we presently have, but to recognize also that Blackness engenders a sort of possibility that is represented by the fact that we're still here despite the 400 plus years of racial terror that our ancestors have lived through. And so as I get closer to the end here, it is in and through this tradition that this story of possibility emerges for me. And I tell it through these 9 principles as a way to help give some teeth to this process of centering possibility. So if I believe something is whole, my approach to it sort of centers on sharpening it and making it better. If I believe it's broken, then I approach it from the position of its brokenness. Actions begin with words, thoughts, and thoughts with beliefs, and beliefs with values. Centering possibility insists on practicing and nurturing convictions about Black youth's inherent capacity to accomplish anything they put their minds to doing, the substance of their own human appetite and desire, despite what adults may think is best, or the social conditions engineered to stymie their curiosity. Any other ideological arrangement renders possibility invisible or of little consequence. And this text, it's a little small, thin little book, is of an intervention to this form of thinking.
Dr. Warren.
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, but Dr. Gooch Grayson might want to speak. We were going to open her mic, but she just wanted you to know you're preaching.
Thank you. Well, I'm getting to the end here, and I'm excited to just delve into some conversation and hear folks' reflections on this. But I want to end here. these words, I started the talk with a verse from a song that I wrote that's actually in the epilogue and the prologue of the book about mourning. And truly, even as I sit and sort of mourn the relationships and the folks and think about the state of gun violence in this country and the loss of my line brother and the loss of Twitch and all of these Black men and women and gender non-binary folks who lose their lives every day. The only thing that has been really helpful in managing and living through these moments, because we don't have a choice but to live through these moments, has been glimpsing what these moments have to teach us about possibility. And I think about the work of two scholars from Howard University who studied Black women who lost their children to state violence, and what those women did with what they talk about making their grief public. And by making their grief public, using their platforms as a space to contribute to the movement for Black lives and essentially figure out through their pain what possibility might look like on the other side. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Warren. And I appreciate your letting me jump in and share some thoughts from the audience as time went on. Encourage the audience to send your thoughts through. Ingrid wants you to know she loves Roberta Flack and Donny Hathaway.
Me too, me too. Roberta Flack is like very much undervalued. And we love Donny. Hands down, one of the best to ever do it.
And I want to thank you for starting out with your own music. And that's something that we did not share in your introduction. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about your background in music?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I've been singing my whole life. I grew up singing in a group called the Soul Children of Chicago. If you've ever heard the gospel song, How Excellent, oh Lord, how excellent, that's the Soul Children. And Shabbat and a bunch of other songs, famous children's choir from the 80s and the 90s. And yeah, I've just always been a singer, but I've always sort of been on this path to be a teacher. So music was always something that was sort of something I just did as a hobby. But I've always been engaged in various professional capacities, doing session work, and I have lots of friends who are professionals in the industry. And during the pandemic, one of the things I just decided was that I needed to be investing myself in all of the ways that I find joy and excitement. And music has always been that for me. And I said, I think I'm marginally better than mediocre, so I should go ahead and give it a try. But I've always also enjoyed writing music, and I think my music represents what I write it and think about as a scholar. So the music is simply just another platform and another venue to get ideas out in ways that people will not get them in a book or article that I write. So yeah, I've always just been around music, but just decided I want to be my full 1000% whole multidimensional self, even in the academic marketplace. And so wrapping music into that has been an important part of that journey. And it's been just really healing more generally.
Were there ways that you were able to use music in the classroom when you were teaching in Chicago?
Yeah, well, first of all, I was always like the person responsible for like the choir. You know, music programs, I worked at Chicago Public Schools. The music programs were always either non-existent or very minimal. So I was always called on to do, you know, like build a choir, train a choir, to do the music for special events. But I think for me too, because I taught math and there are so many different things you had to remember, I would always create little rhymes and rhythms and think before folks were doing or formally talking about and writing about hip hop education, which, to be clear, is far more expansive than integrating rap into the classroom. It's far more expansive than that. But the importance of tapping in culturally to students using all the forms of expression available to me that felt authentic to me, not manufacturing something because it's cool to do. So I would never say, hey, y'all should rap to make connect with your kids. But I knew that there were ways that I could weave rhythm and rhyme into the classroom that were really helpful to me. And more generally, I do this even today as a college professor with graduate students. We're listening to music when we come in. When we're working independently, I'm always playing music. So it just helps to create a atmosphere that teaching and learning, like any institution, can be very sterile and stripped down of our humanity if we allow it to. Music helps to minimize and reduce or eliminate those sort of barriers to human connection. So I've always just found ways to make music a mainstay in any classroom that I'm in, because it does that. It pulls people into a place where they feel comfortable to engage at a deeper level.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I asked that question because just you answered it so well. You covered everything I was thinking, but the sterile nature of education can really be hard for a lot of kids. And thinking of centering possibility, you helped us to see that you have to look at what all the possibilities are.
Mm-hmm. Well, and part of what Kelly argues in that book, Freedom Dreams, and why this book has over 30 pieces of art in it and poetry. I couldn't print the lyrics to some of these songs because of copyright. So I just say, you know, cue Whitney Houston's Greatest Love of All. And anybody reading the book will know what that song is. But that needed to be in a book like this, because what Kelly argues is that any justice project has always had music in its landscape, in part because art communicates a world that we don't yet have words to describe. We can see it in the shape of a portrait, right? Or we can hear it in a moan, in the way that a song is being delivered. We can see and visualize a world that we don't have yet, or words to describe yet, in and through art. So that's always, I knew doing a book like this and having this conversation about possibility had to be really expansive and inclusive of the multiple ways that we express ourselves, in part because I articulate possibility as embodied in the faces and the bodies of the Black children that we serve.
I wrote down a lot of things that you said, and could you delve a little bit more into needing a way to anchor yourself when it feels like not much is being accomplished? Can you give some examples of your experiences at any educational level and what you saw accomplished?
One of the things that I think about, one way that I anchor myself is setting my expectations appropriately. I remember coming into, my nice cushy R1 faculty position at Michigan State, thinking, all right, they got me. They know exactly what I'm about. I'm about to tear it up. And we were in a faculty meeting, and we were having some issues about, or having some conversation about climate in the college for women, for minoritized populations. And someone said, the approach that we're taking is in itself oppressive and not equitable. And the person leading the meeting at that time said, thank you for that comment, and then kept doing what they were doing, because they had a very clear agenda and that's what they wanted to do. And in that moment, I realized this institution has been the way it's been for 100+ years. Me being here is not going to change this institution. And I should readjust my expectation that I can change the institution. And so then in readjusting that expectation, I was like, okay, well, what is my work? What is my project? What should I be doing here? And I realized one thing I should be doing is, one, being as authentic and honest about who I am and how I show up, so that people are unsurprised when they get the versions of me that they may find unsavory, but also that my students who are coming into this institution, who feel like they don't belong because they're the first or the only, they need to see me being as Black, as musical, as thoughtful, as read, as erudite as I need to be, so that they can see themselves and feel like they're making space. And that was an important pivot for me. And when I am frustrated by the lack of progress around implementation of a policy or not getting enough funding for an initiative, I am reminded and I return myself time and again to the sort of relationships that I build with students and how important it's been for me to create classroom spaces just to talk out how they're feeling, or to write a grant so that I could put them on it so that they can have summer funding and so give them the sort of support and mentorship they need to finish their programs. It's been that for me. So it's finding really productive ways to take the frustration and the disappointment for progress not being made at the speeds that we want, and remembering both who came before me and what my commitments are in the spaces that I'm in. Yeah, that's been important. I'll say that one other thing is that I'm reminded of, and I use that word remembering, trigger me a little bit. I actually start the book, and part of when I interpret this cover, you can kind of see it. There are like these hands that are coming out, and when I first saw this cover, I thought this is possibility, right? When I look at this, I'm looking at possibility. What does this mean for these to be perhaps the ancestors? And remembering the stories of our foremothers and our forefathers, remembering their stories as fuel and what they've overcome as fuel for me to manage, in many ways, the first world problems that I'm attempting to manage now, today. That's been a really important part of anchoring me to my work, and sort of not counting, I guess, not being resigned that things can never be different. Just remembering where we've come and who's done it before me, and just recognizing that I have a small role to play.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We're talking about education. We're talking about DEI. Are there moments when you need to just get away and refresh? Any recommendations out there for somebody who might be watching, who needs to know what they, practices they could take on, maybe outside of work, to refresh?
I think community is really, really important in this regard. Part of my academic work is studying empathy. One of the things that I've learned in studying empathy is that you don't need an action necessarily. What we all need is just connection, and we need to feel as if we are seen and valued. So part of the work is just sitting in community with people with whom you don't have to explain any of what you're feeling, and they just get it, right? I want to speak the name of my line brother who I lost suddenly in December. Somebody who was just so full of love and care for everybody, who was always just so committed to everybody's well-being and community. And as I've been mourning and grieving his death, part of what I recognize is that there are so few people who will understand the nature of our relationship. It was 10 of us. There are 8 other people in the world who will understand our relationship. I just need to sometimes be in community with those people, because I don't have to talk, I don't have to explain. I can just be with them and they recognize where I am, and that's enough, right? So I think that community piece cannot be understated. And I've often in consultant work with districts and organizations want to think out loud about how the institution both finances and incentivizes groups of people who identify themselves to share an affinity, to be able to build the sort of space that they need to build to be in community together, right? We create those types of communities on our own. So we talk about it fugitively, But I think it's important too for institutions to consider how they allow folks to build the sort of spaces that they need. They finance those spaces and then they take their hands off of those spaces and not have an expectation or set an agenda for what those spaces are, and allow the folks occupying those spaces to create and set that agenda, I think is also really important.
Thank you. Appreciate your sharing all of that. So today's title is Centering Possibility in Black Education. In your thoughts and your efforts, what are the possibilities and dreams that you have for Black education?
Well, one, that we approach the work of transformation again from the place of our possibility and not the many problems that we face, that our conversations don't begin and end with deficit, that we tell stories in ways. There were some papers I read a couple years ago that said how you tell a story has health impacts. If you constantly hear a story and about all the things that was bad that happened in the story, that's going to impact you in terms of your physical well-being, versus talking about the ways that we overcome and that we travail and we transcend. That's framing is everything, right? And how we tell good stories and how we make good arguments. And so I think that that's a dream that I have, that we continue to remember, as Bettina Love writes about, what our North Star is, and we be anchored to the needs of our children. And that will often cost us something. It will cost us some comfort. It may cost us some relationships. A lot of problems that we have are because of our politics and our politicking. And so I dream about how we exercise influence with little regard, with less regard to what makes us feel good, and greater regard to representing those who are not sitting in the spaces of influence that we are. Yeah, those are a few things. I mean, the big picture is that we be free, but that costs something. It always costs something. And how we get there, there are folks who write about this as that freedom is aspirational. For as long as we're on this earth, we're going to be exploring and trying to get to a place where we feel completely and fully free. But I hope or dream about young people having more of those spaces where they feel fully free than not, even if they don't feel it in the world at large.
Thank you so very much. We're at the point where I'm going to ask you, do you have any final messages for the audience today?
I think I've folks are very patient and done a lot of listening. So I don't know if folks had any questions or other thoughts, but I just appreciate being able to take time and share space with all of you on Love Day. So sending you all love wherever you are. Yeah, and just please keep in touch if that can be. You can find me on the Twitter if you tweet at Chezare Augustus. My music eventually will be on the social media platforms, but always you can find me at my website, ChezareWarren.com. You can get in touch with me that way. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And they may have been peaceful and quiet, but they stayed. They weren't leaving. They're mesmerized, right? So thank you so very much. It was really great to have you here, and with the flexibility that you gave us after we had to cancel, we appreciate that also.
Pleasure.
I wish that your insights and expertise will make a difference in our approach and implementation of work and community interactions. It's a good hope for Valentine's Day that love can spread out. We need to pause, think, and deliver in ways that enrich education for all. And audience members, again, it's been a really busy month. I'm so thankful for you. It's our honor and pleasure to have you with us here and throughout the year. Thank you for your questions and comments today. Sydney's going to put up an evaluation slide.
I'll jump off. Thank you again, everybody. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. On Thursday, we hope that you will come back to us for our final program in Black History Month. Many of you know that the quarter is about to end here, so we're honoring the time of our students and faculty by giving them a little break, but Thursday, the 16th at 2 o'clock Central Time, we will be watching a documentary. This is a Zoom only opportunity. The documentary is called Finding the Gold Within. And then after we present that, we're excited that Mr. Kevin Reese, formerly at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and now at Georgia Southern University, will be leading the discussion. So we'll see you hopefully on Thursday, and thank you everybody for being with us. Take care. Happy Valentine's Day.